Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In November 1978, 4 young employees working the closing shift at a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana, vanished without a trace. What started as a suspected petty theft would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister. The brutal murders of Jane Freet, Ruth Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemons, aged just 16 to 20, would become one of Indiana's most haunting unsolved cases. Tonight, we'll explore how a routine Friday night at a fast food restaurant turned into a decades-long mystery that continues to haunt investigators to this day. Let's begin. On the night of November 17, 1978, in Speedway, Indiana, what began as an ordinary Friday evening shift at a Burger Chef restaurant would evolve into one of the state's most haunting unsolved crimes. The fast food establishment, located at 5725 Crawfordsville Road, was staffed by 4 young employees: Jane Freet, the 20-year-old assistant manager, Ruth Ellen Shelton, just 17, Daniel Davis, also 17, and Mark Flemons, only 16 years old. The Burger Chef was a popular chain at the time, similar to McDonald's, and this particular location was situated in a busy commercial area of Speedway, a suburban community just outside Indianapolis. On that fateful Friday night, the restaurant was scheduled to close at 11 p.m. as usual. The last known customers reported everything appearing normal, with the young staff going about their routine duties. However, when the morning shift arrived at 4:30 a.m. on Saturday, they discovered an alarming scene. The back door was unlocked, and there was no sign of the 4 employees who should have closed up the night before. Even more disturbing, the safe was open and approximately $581 was missing. What appeared at first glance to be a possible robbery and employee theft would soon reveal itself to be something far more sinister. Initially, local law enforcement didn't treat the disappearance with the urgency it deserved. They initially suspected the young workers might have taken the money and gone off for a joyride, perhaps planning to return later. This assumption would prove to be a costly mistake in the investigation, as crucial early hours were lost. The restaurant wasn't immediately treated as a crime scene. The morning crew cleaned up, contaminating potential evidence. They wiped down surfaces and moved items around, unknowingly destroying what could have been vital clues. It wasn't until later that day, when none of the missing employees could be reached and their concerned families began calling the police, that investigators began to take the situation more seriously. As detectives finally began processing the scene, they found several telling details. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the perpetrator or perpetrators might have entered while the restaurant was still open or had access to a key. 2 empty bags that normally contained buns were missing. The safe had been opened without damage, indicating whoever opened it likely knew the combination or forced someone who did to open it. More ominously, police found Jane Freet's car still in the parking lot, with her purse inside. They also discovered what appeared to be drag marks near the back door, suggesting at least one of the victims had been forcibly removed from the premises. Several small drops of blood were found near the back door, though the amount wasn't significant enough to indicate a major injury. The investigation kicked into high gear when witnesses began coming forward with crucial information about the previous night. A customer who had visited the restaurant around 10:45 p.m. reported everything seemed normal, with all 4 employees present and working. However, another witness reported seeing 2 suspicious men in the parking lot around 11 p.m., though this sighting couldn't be definitively connected to the crime. Perhaps the most significant early lead came from a police officer who had driven past the Burger Chef around midnight. He noticed several cars in the parking lot, but, assuming it was employees closing up, didn't stop to investigate. This timing would later prove crucial in establishing the timeline of events. The community was quickly gripped by fear and confusion. How could 4 young people simply vanish from a busy commercial area? The families of the missing teenagers and young adults were desperate for answers, and the local media began extensive coverage of the case. Missing person posters were distributed throughout the region, and searches were organized in the surrounding areas. The investigation took a devastating turn 2 days later, on Sunday, November 19th. The bodies of all 4 victims were discovered in a remote wooded area near Johnson County, about 20 miles southeast of the Burger Chef restaurant. The scene that investigators encountered was horrific and would haunt them for decades to come. Jane Freet had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, with the knife blade broken off in her heart. Ruth Shelton and Daniel Davis had both been shot execution style with a .38 caliber weapon. Mark Flemons, the youngest victim, had apparently died from blunt force trauma to his head, though some investigators believed he might have choked to death on his own blood while trying to escape through the woods. The position and condition of the bodies suggested they had been killed shortly after their abduction. The 2 empty bun bags from the restaurant were found near the bodies, leading investigators to believe they might have been used to cover the victims' heads during transport. The remote location where the bodies were found was significant. It was an area that would have been difficult to find without local knowledge, suggesting the perpetrators were familiar with the region. The brutal nature of the killings and the different methods used to murder each victim led investigators to believe multiple perpetrators were involved. The variation in killing methods also suggested a crime that had spiraled out of control, perhaps starting as a robbery, but evolving into something far more violent and deadly. The investigation revealed that the victims had likely been forced to lie face down in the leaves while their killers decided their fate. The medical examiner determined that all 4 had been killed in the early hours of Saturday morning, meaning they had likely been alive for several hours after their abduction from the restaurant. The randomness of the victim selection and the excessive violence used led investigators to consider various theories. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Was there a personal connection to one or more of the victims? Or were these young people simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by opportunistic killers? The brutality of the murders sent shockwaves through the community, and investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that tragic night. One peculiar detail that emerged was that Mark Flemons' uniform was covered in leaves and briars, suggesting he had tried to escape through the woods before succumbing to his injuries. This detail added another layer of horror to the crime. At least one of the victims had been conscious and aware enough to attempt flight from their captors. The investigation revealed more about the victims' final hours. Trace evidence suggested they had been transported in at least 2 vehicles. Fibers and hair samples were collected from the scene, but in 1978, DNA testing wasn't available to process this evidence effectively. The technology that might have cracked the case was still years away. Several witnesses came forward with information about suspicious activities around the Burger Chef that night. One reported seeing a dark-colored van in the parking lot around closing time. Another witnessed what appeared to be 2 men forcing someone into a car, but had assumed it was just young people fooling around. These sightings, while potentially crucial, couldn't be definitively linked to the crimes due to the darkness and the witnesses' distance from the events. The police developed an early theory that the crimes might have been connected to a series of robberies targeting fast food restaurants in the area. In the months leading up to the Burger Chef murders, several establishments had been hit by armed robbers who seemed to know restaurant procedures. However, none of these previous robberies had resulted in violence, let alone murder. One compelling lead involved a man named James Wood, who was questioned extensively about the murders. Wood had been arrested for a similar restaurant robbery in the area, and some witnesses claimed he bore a resemblance to composite sketches created from witness descriptions of men seen at the Burger Chef that night. However, investigators couldn't develop enough evidence to charge him, and he maintained his innocence until his death in 1988. The investigation also focused on possible connections to local drug trafficking. Speedway had experienced several drug-related crimes in the months leading up to the murders. Some investigators theorized that the restaurant might have been targeted as part of a drug-related dispute, though no concrete evidence ever emerged to support this theory. Another avenue of investigation centered on potential inside knowledge of the restaurant's operations. The fact that the safe had been opened without damage suggested someone familiar with the business might have been involved. Investigators interviewed former employees and people connected to the restaurant, but couldn't develop any solid leads from this angle. A particularly disturbing theory emerged when investigators discovered that just months before the murders, the Speedway area had been terrorized by a series of bombings. The Speedway bomber, Brett Kimberlin, had conducted a campaign of terror in the community, though he was eventually caught and convicted for those crimes. While some speculated about a connection between the bombings and the Burger Chef murders, no evidence ever linked the two cases. The investigation was hampered by several factors beyond the initial mishandling of the crime scene. The remote location where the bodies were found had been exposed to 2 days of rain, washing away potentially crucial evidence. The wooded area was also popular with hunters and locals, meaning many people had passed through, further contaminating the scene. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews and followed up on countless leads. They discovered that several people had been in the vicinity of the murder scene in the early hours of Saturday morning. A group of teenagers had been parking in the area, and hunters had been preparing for an early morning start. However, none reported hearing gunshots or witnessing anything suspicious. The families of the victims struggled to cope with their devastating losses. Jane Freet's brother, Jim, became particularly vocal about the case, regularly speaking to media and pressing law enforcement for answers. "These were just kids," he would often say in interviews. "They were working an honest job on a Friday night, and someone took everything from them." The case took a toll on the investigators as well. Detective Jerry Loy, one of the original investigators, would later recall, "This one never left me. The senselessness of it, the youth of the victims, the fact that we came so close but could never quite solve it. It haunts you." In 1984, a significant development occurred when an inmate in the Indiana State Prison claimed to have information about the murders. He provided details that seemed to match the crime scene, but after extensive investigation, his story couldn't be verified. This pattern would repeat itself over the years. Promising leads would emerge, only to fade under scrutiny. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the late 1970s. Evidence that might be crucial today, DNA, advanced fiber analysis, digital surveillance footage, simply wasn't available to investigators at the time. The physical evidence that was collected, including the murder weapons and trace evidence from the victim's clothing, couldn't be analyzed with the sophistication possible in modern laboratories. The passage of time has presented both challenges and opportunities for the investigation. In 2018, 40 years after the murders, the Indiana State Police announced they were using new technology to re-examine evidence from the case. Advanced DNA testing techniques, unavailable in 1978, were applied to items recovered from both the restaurant and the murder scene. While the results of these tests haven't been publicly disclosed, investigators maintain that the case remains active. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case has been the number of strong suspects who have emerged over the years, only to be eliminated through investigation or lack of evidence. In the late 1980s, investigators focused on a group of local criminals known to have committed similar restaurant robberies. Several members of this group matched witness descriptions from the night of the murders, but alibis and lack of physical evidence prevented any charges from being filed. In 1999, a woman came forward with what seemed to be a breakthrough. She claimed her ex-husband had been involved in the murders, providing details that hadn't been publicly released. According to her statement, her ex-husband and several associates had planned to rob the burger chef, but panicked when one of the employees recognized one of them. This led to the abduction and eventual murders. However, despite extensive investigation, police couldn't corroborate her story sufficiently to make arrests. The case has also been plagued by what investigators call false confessions. Over the years, numerous individuals have claimed responsibility for the murders, either seeking attention or suffering from mental illness. Each of these confessions required thorough investigation, draining resources that might have been better spent pursuing other leads. Detective Mark Van Arsdale, who worked the case in the 1990s, noted, "We've probably had 15 to 20 people confess to these murders over the years. Each one has to be taken seriously, but none of them have panned out." One theory that has persisted involves a possible connection to organized crime. In the late 1970s, several organized crime families had interests in Indianapolis and the surrounding areas. Some investigators believed the murders might have been a message or a warning, though the excessive violence and the young age of the victims didn't fit typical organized crime patterns. The case has also highlighted the evolution of investigative techniques. Modern criminal profiling suggests the killers were likely young men, probably in their 20s at the time, who knew the area well. The level of violence, particularly against Jane Freet, indicates possible personal motivation or extreme anger. The fact that different weapons were used suggests multiple killers with different levels of criminal experience. Some of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case involve the victims' families and their decades-long wait for justice. Ruth Shelton's sister, Barbara, has been particularly vocal about the impact of the unsolved murders. "It's not just 4 people who died that night," she said in a 2018 interview. "It's entire families who have never been the same. We've lived with this every day for over 40 years." The impact on the community of Speedway has been equally lasting. The Burger Chef restaurant closed shortly after the murders and was eventually demolished. The site, now occupied by a different business, still draws curious visitors and true crime enthusiasts. Local residents who lived through the events still speak of how the murders changed their sense of security forever. The case has also influenced police procedures in Indiana and beyond. The initial mishandling of the crime scene led to significant changes in how missing persons cases are handled. Law enforcement agencies now treat unexplained disappearances with much more urgency, particularly when they occur in conjunction with other crimes like robbery. In recent years, retired detectives who worked the case have expressed both frustration and hope. Advances in forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, have solved many cold cases from the same era. Several pieces of evidence from the Burger Chef murders have been preserved and could potentially yield results with new testing methods. The case has also generated renewed interest through true crime podcasts and documentaries. While this attention has brought in new tips and information, it has also led to speculation and theories that investigators have had to address. Some of these theories have focused on possible connections to other unsolved crimes from the same period, though none have been definitively linked to the Burger Chef murders. One particularly compelling aspect of the case that continues to intrigue investigators is the selection of the murder location. The wooded area where the bodies were found was not easily accessible, especially at night. This suggests at least one of the killers had intimate knowledge of the area, possibly having spent time there before the murders. This detail has led investigators to believe that at least one of the perpetrators was local to the Johnson County area. The different methods of killing have also continued to puzzle investigators. The use of multiple weapons suggests the murders weren't carefully planned, but rather escalated from what might have begun as a robbery. The brutal stabbing of Jane Freet, in particular, has led some investigators to believe she might have recognized one of the attackers, prompting a more personal and violent response. Recent interviews with retired investigators have revealed previously undisclosed details about the case. For instance, there were reports of a car similar to one seen at the Burger Chef being spotted near the murder location in the early hours of Saturday morning. While this lead was investigated at the time, the vehicle and its occupants were never identified. The investigation has also been complicated by the deaths of several potential witnesses and suspects over the years. In 2003, a man who had been considered a person of interest in the late 1980s died, taking whatever knowledge he might have had to his grave. Similarly, several witnesses who reported seeing suspicious activity near the Burger Chef that night have passed away, making it impossible to conduct follow-up interviews with modern investigative techniques. The physical evidence from the case remains in storage at the Indiana State Police Laboratory. Among the items preserved are the broken knife blade from Jane Freet's murder, shell casings from the .38 caliber weapon used to kill Ruth Shelton and Daniel Davis, and fibers from the victim's clothing. In 2020, investigators announced they were exploring the possibility of using advanced touch DNA analysis on these items, a technique that wasn't available even a few years ago. One of the more puzzling aspects of the case that continues to draw attention is the apparent randomness of the victim selection, combined with the seemingly personal nature of the violence. Criminal profilers who have reviewed the case suggest this dichotomy might indicate that while the victims as a group were chosen randomly, one of them may have been specifically targeted or recognized one of the attackers during the crime. The treatment of Mark Flemons has particularly interested modern investigators. The fact that he was able to run through the woods suggests he might have been less carefully guarded than the others, possibly because the killers were focused on Jane Freet at the time. This has led to speculation that Freet might have been the primary target, with the others killed to eliminate witnesses. In 2015, a retired police officer came forward with an interesting observation that hadn't been previously emphasized. He noted that the weekend of the murders coincided with the opening of deer hunting season in Indiana. This might explain why gunshots in the rural area where the bodies were found didn't raise immediate alarm, and also suggests the killers were familiar enough with local patterns to know their actions might go unnoticed. The case has also raised questions about other unsolved crimes from the same period. In 1979, less than a year after the Burger Chef murders, another restaurant robbery occurred in nearby Marion County with similar characteristics, though fortunately without fatal results. While investigators could never prove a connection, the similarities were striking enough to warrant continued investigation. Some of the original physical evidence has been lost or degraded over the years, a common problem in cold cases. However, crime scene photographs and detailed documentation remain, allowing modern investigators to apply new analytical techniques to the visual evidence. Advanced photographic enhancement has revealed details that weren't visible in the original prints, though none have yet led to a breakthrough in the case. The families of the victims have remained active in keeping the case in the public eye. They've established social media groups and websites dedicated to sharing information about the murders and encouraging people to come forward with information. These efforts have generated numerous tips over the years, though none have led to arrests. In 2019, investigators revealed that they had been able to develop partial DNA profiles from some of the evidence, though they haven't publicly specified which items yielded results. While these profiles aren't complete enough for traditional database matching, they could potentially be useful for genetic genealogy analysis, a technique that has solved numerous cold cases in recent years. The case has also become a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies. The initial mishandling of the scene and the delay in treating the disappearances as potential crimes serve as powerful examples of how crucial the first hours of an investigation can be. Modern police training often references the Burger Chef murders when discussing proper protocols for missing persons cases and crime scene preservation. Local residents who lived through the events still speak of the profound impact the murders had on the community. Many parents who had previously allowed their teenage children to work evening shifts at restaurants became more protective. Businesses in the area increased security measures, and many began requiring multiple employees to leave together at closing time. The Indiana State Police maintain an active file on the case, and a detective is still assigned to it. They continue to receive tips and leads, though less frequently than in the past. However, they emphasize that even decades-old information could be valuable, as it might corroborate other evidence or provide new avenues for investigation. In 2021, investigators began exploring the possibility of creating a genetic snapshot from the available DNA evidence, a technique that can predict physical characteristics of a person based on their genetic material. While the results of this analysis haven't been made public, it represents another example of how advancing technology might eventually help solve this decades-old case. The Burger Chef murders remain one of Indiana's most notorious unsolved crimes, not just because of their brutality, but because they represent a loss of innocence for a community and era. 4 young people, simply doing their jobs on an ordinary Friday night, became victims of a crime that continues to resonate more than 4 decades later. Their stories serve as a reminder of the importance of justice, no matter how much time has passed, and the enduring impact of unsolved crimes on families and communities. The case has also highlighted the evolution of criminal investigation techniques over the decades. In 2022, investigators began using artificial intelligence programs to analyze patterns in historical records, looking for connections that human investigators might have missed. This technology can process vast amounts of data, including old police reports, witness statements, and even newspaper articles, searching for subtle patterns or connections that might provide new leads. The psychological impact on the surviving family members continues to be profound. Ruth Shelton's family established a scholarship in her memory at her former high school, ensuring that her dream of helping others lives on. Daniel Davis's sister has become an advocate for victims' rights and cold case investigations, frequently speaking at law enforcement conferences about the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases. One of the most poignant aspects of the case is how it changed workplace safety protocols, particularly for young employees. Many businesses now have strict policies about closing procedures, security measures, and minimum staff requirements during late hours. These changes, while important, serve as a bitter reminder of the lessons learned from the Burger Chef tragedy. Recent interviews with retired investigators have revealed that several potential suspects have been monitored over the years, even though there wasn't enough evidence to make arrests. Some of these individuals have since died, but others are still alive and remain persons of interest. As one detective noted, "We know there are people out there who have information about this case. Some of them might have carried this secret for over 40 years, and maybe now, in their later years, they're ready to clear their conscience." The case has also become a focal point for discussions about the preservation of evidence in cold cases. While some physical evidence from the Burger Chef murders has been well preserved, other items were lost or degraded before modern forensic techniques became available. This has led to changes in evidence storage protocols and the creation of specialized cold case storage facilities in many jurisdictions. In 2023, investigators began exploring the use of isotope analysis on physical evidence from the crime scenes. This technique can potentially provide information about where a person has lived based on chemical signatures in hair or fiber samples. While the results of these tests are still pending, they represent another example of how modern science might shed new light on this decades-old case. The impact on the Speedway community continues to resonate. Local historians note that the murders marked a turning point in how the suburb was perceived. What had been seen as a safe, close-knit community suddenly seemed vulnerable. This shift in perception led to increased security measures throughout the area and a greater emphasis on community policing programs. The case has also influenced how missing persons cases are handled nationwide. The initial assumption that the young workers had simply taken the money and run delayed the investigation critically. Today, law enforcement agencies are trained to treat unexplained workplace disappearances as potential crimes until proven otherwise, a direct result of lessons learned from the Burger Chef case. As technology continues to advance, hope remains that this case might still be solved. The combination of preserved evidence, advancing forensic techniques, and the possibility that someone might finally come forward with information keeps the investigation active. As one current investigator noted, cold cases are never truly cold as long as someone is still looking for answers. The legacy of Jane Freet, Ruth Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemons lives on through their families' continued pursuit of justice and through the changes their tragic deaths brought to law enforcement and workplace safety. Their story serves as a reminder that behind every unsolved case are real people, families still waiting for answers, and communities forever changed by acts of violence that remain unexplained. The investigation continues, and with each new technological advancement or investigative technique, there's renewed hope that one day, the full truth about what happened on that November night in 1978 will finally come to light.